to a certain extent, this is what the Brace-Lee-Solis system does in obviously quite a humorous, flawed way. But it's attempting to create an objective language to highlight the fluency of our own languages.
Do you think it's significant that all the maths, the multiplication and the addition is going on this side of the screen? So can we say that the maths is not really part of reality?
Yeah,
it's maths is always described as this sort of fundamental.
Yeah, it is of numbers as a kind of machine, so that once the real object is taken into this machine, it enters the world of number, so to speak.
Yeah. So that's the act of counting, and then that's the act of adding, and that's the act of multiplying. So there's these stages of moving away, but in each case you're compounding a sort of conceptualization of what's actually out there. You never really deal with what's out there. You process your sense data, and then eventually you reduce things to categories of similar objects that can be counted. But yeah, you think, oh look, there's 5 rabbits. There's not 5 rabbits. There's this unique, miraculous, self-organizing chunk of matter that's sentient and metabolizing, and oh, there's another one, and another one, and another one, and they're not. It's not even another one. Each one is its own unique miracle. The fact they look a bit like each other is because there's this process of they can reproduce themselves. That makes it even more miraculous. And yet we start as just 5 rabbits. What's the problem? So we are continually breaking the world down into chunks that we can relate to each other, but those relations are not in the world. If they are, we're projecting them. It's all in here. And so it's a good point actually. I hadn't thought about that. You're just looking at the front end of screens. You go behind it, or there's a rabbit and there's electronics. I don't quite know what that means, but it only works that way. Yeah. So
this is kind of where you're trying to get.
Yeah, you're trying to get behind the circuit board and see what the process is.
You've got, and on the drawing, you've got the sort of the realm of this critical strip of one-ing that happens at a certain point. Inside the camera, something
happens.
Something at some point during the circuitry, something in the sort of quantum sort of action things going on inside that motherboard. It gets 1, and then it gets 2'd, and then it gets 3.
The 2 gets 3. Ah, except it's gone now.
That's kind of
the class. 0. Yeah, but that's an interesting point. If there's nothing on the plinth, then there's 0 on the screen, and 0 plus anything is 0, and you multiply anything by 0, and it's still 0. So there are metaphors we didn't intend, basically.
Any more questions?
For Matthew, do you have any fear or phobia of any particular number, or do you know of any mathematician that would have, and is there a disorder?
The first stage was about number superstitions, did we?
Yeah, we did.
I don't really have, no. I had a thing about 23s for a while, but it's just a phase I think I'm going through. I like it.
I haven't even been through that phase yet.
I think it's a kind of early.
You probably went through this when you were 2, right? And I haven't reached that stage yet.
What about infinity?
Infinity's not a number. Yeah, this is a mistake. It's been propagated for far too long. Children often ask their parents what's the biggest number, in the same way that they'll ask what's the biggest animal, what's the tallest mountain, and some parents will say there isn't one, which is the correct answer, and others will say, oh yeah, it's called infinity, and that has led to endless confusion. But that's no, I don't really have. I'm sure I do at some level have a subliminal set of feelings, relationships with each of the integers. I remember being a child and doing simple arithmetic and sitting next to my friend, working on our sums, and we'd actually be chatting about which numbers we liked and which ones we didn't, and why, and which. It was like we were talking about our friends, different personalities, and then it just gradually gets ironed out of you as you get older if you're going to be successful.
You spoke about your feeling that perhaps the fact that autistic people have this kind of relationship to number, and particularly with prime numbers, might tell us something about.
That's right.
Or somehow be a piece of evidence.
Yeah, that's so. To complete your question, I don't know any mathematicians that have they would admit to having strong feelings about any particular number. They might secretly, you never know. But Robin just mentioned something that we were discussing on the first day. It's a lot of this stuff's covered in the first chapter of my book, where I just sort of discuss the general issue of how humans relate to numbers before I get into the more detailed matters. But there's been some really interesting studies of people with various conditions which would fall on what's, I think, called the sort of spectrum of autistic, or autistic spectrum these days. The language is a bit unclear. There's Asperger's, there's autism, and no one's quite sure where these boundaries are. But there's a set of neurological, psychological, maybe, I don't know what the appropriate terminology would be. But there are people with various conditions whose perceptions of reality seem radically different from the rest of ours. And one thing which seems to show up a lot is an affinity with number, a sort of a tendency to gravitate towards numbers as something familiar and stable, or a source of some sort of comfort in the world.
Friends.
Yeah, and prime numbers seem to show up quite regularly as having some sort of different texture or quality. I mean, it's very difficult to translate this into something we can talk about because we're not in this state. There's one very, very interesting writer called Daniel Tammet. You might have come across, some of you, a book called Born on a Blue Day. And he has a very severe sort of Asperger's type condition, but he also has this savant condition where he's one of these super geniuses who can learn languages in a few hours and, you know, perform ridiculously complicated calculations. Some people have that, some people have severe Asperger's. There's about 3 people in the world that have both, and he's one of them. So he's a kind of living Rosetta Stone. He can experience the world in this radically different way, but he can also invent these incredibly effective ways of describing it to us. He's featured in the media a bit over the last few years, and he's written this book where he talks about his feelings towards numbers. He talks about prime numbers being these sort of signposts that when he's sort of drifting off to sleep, he's in this landscape of number, and if he feels a little bit lost or uncomfortable, he'll see a prime number and it will be a sort of pointer somewhere. He also says they're smooth like pebbles, and the other numbers have different textures. There's been various work by neuroscientists on children and people with various abnormal conditions, people who've had brain damage, people who've had severed lobes and things, and how they relate to number. And all of it seems to indicate, to me, and this is a huge leap as a mathematician, that some of these people are actually experiencing something about the world, the realm of number, that the rest of us aren't. It's not just a disorder, it's not just a short-circuiting or something, you know. Sort of synesthesia you could understand perhaps, you know, sort of smelling colours and tasting sounds and things, as just sort of crossed wires. But this seems to be something else. It's almost as if they're reaching into the true, whatever that would be, world of number, and the rest of us are just sort of looking at reflections of it, but they can't generally communicate much about it to us. So I think we just have to maintain a humility and accept we don't really know what we're dealing with, which is my stance towards the nervous system.
You talked about the Rosetta Stone, and in a sense this facility to experience the abstract world of number in this way and express it is kind of like the ultimate prize in terms of this problem we've been discussing this week, is that, you know, if we could somehow develop some kind of apparatus or some kind of artwork, some kind of pedagogical process that would allow people to really inhabit this world, you know, what difference would that make to the way in which we understand number, and through that the way we understand the world? That's really the kind of speculative horizon of your work and of this question about dramatising abstract concepts.
Yeah.
Your dramatisation is somehow hauling these esoteric ideas back to something that we can get hold of. But a lot of the advances in science and physics is when you can release yourself from that process. You can get to ideas like quantum mechanics ideas, where you put something in a box and it also exists outside the box. You get ideas where 1 and 1 make 3 for us. Do you think that some way of what you're doing the reversing, you suddenly, like you say, when you moved your little model into that halfway position, you're actually using this to get another investigation into things that we can't quite get a grasp of.
Well, that seems to be the promise that this approach holds. I mean, it wasn't what we set out to do, and it wasn't what anyone expected.